Scholars, welcome back. Today we're going to talk about social media. This is probably the thing you've all been very excited to talk about and perhaps wondering why haven't we talked about it thus far? One of the reasons, as we'll talk about in a minute, is even though social media seem to pervade every part of our life, we need to talk about theories first to understand sort of how we're using them. And secondly, to be able to generalize beyond a particular social medium itself. With that said, let's get into it. So first of all, again, the big question, just what are social media? I think one of the challenges with this topic is everyone can sort of make a point and say that's a social medium if you point at a particular platform. But more challenging is trying to understand conceptually, what are they? Because in some ways, and when we talk about social media, to be flippant about it, when we say it's a social media, aren't all media social? From phones to email to letters, these are all things you're doing to correspond with others. Doesn't that have a social dimension? And since all media are interactional, shouldn't they be social? Well, when we talk about social media, we mean social in a different way. And we mean not a medium that's used for social purposes, but a particular subcategory of media. What are those social media then? When we have this idea in our mind and we say this channel and that channel constitute a social medium, how do we come to that conclusion? What are we implicitly meaning? Well, one way, as Carr and Hayes have defined it, is we define social media as internet-based, persistent, and disentrained channels of mass personal communication, facilitating perceptions of interactivity amongst users, deriving value primarily from user-generated content. Wow, that's long. What the heck does that mean? Let's see if we can dig into some of these elements so that when we say it's a social medium, we know that all of this definition is implied in that meaning. To begin, social media are internet-based. Now, aren't you glad we talked about what's the internet earlier on? The internet is that connection of computers, the networking of computers. And social media are built on the network of computers. Early social media often were built on the web itself, and so you had to go to Friendster.com or Orkut.com in a web browser to get there. But increasingly, we've seen social media move off those and be internet-based. Frankly, between you and me, I think one of the weaknesses of this definition is I think we're going to see this internet-based be the first part of the definition to break. At the South by Southwest Tech Convention a few years ago, there was sort of a proof of concept demonstration of someone doing Bluetooth-based social networking, where once you were in range of a Bluetooth connection, could you connect to the network, which was not internet-based. But that's a little beside the point. For at least now, when we talk about social media, we really talk about something that you have to be online in some way to interact with. You may still get there through a web browser, but increasingly we see this turned over to apps as well. The second part of the definition is that the channel is persistent. Importantly here, it's the channel that's persistent. Even when you're not on the platform and actively using it, the platform still exists and enables others to interact. Importantly, this is different from messages are persistent. I talk to a lot of students that say, oh, well, Snapchat, it's not persistent. No, the Snapchat channel is persistent. Just the messages you post there may not last in perpetuum. And so when we look at channels that are persistent, it can obviously include sort of the big channels that we think about, Twitter and Instagram, but also it can include gaming platforms like Fortnite. Just because you're not logged on and playing at that moment doesn't mean that others aren't. The Fortnite servers and the Fortnite platform or Discord servers exist even when you're not actively using them. Those platforms are in fact persistent. The next part of the definition is probably one of the thornier terms that we deal with, disentrainment, which, contrary to some reviewers, doesn't involve getting on board or off of a train. Rather, when we talk about disentrainment, it means there's some sort of cognitive uncoupling from the message to the sender. Most often, this manifests as giving you a chance for some self-presentational choices. Now, importantly, disentrainment is not the same thing as asynchronous communication. We can still have synchronous communication that is disentrained. Even now in this channel, if I was Zooming with you or FaceTiming with you, I have a choice about what background did I put up? Can I use feature smoothing? There are still some choices that I have about my self-presentation that I wouldn't have face-to-face. Asynchronously, you're watching this video, and if I flub up too many times, I can go back and delete this recording and start it anew. So even if this has been sort of a one-shot recording, it's still disentrained because you don't know how many takes I've had to get this particular shot. 38. Social media, one of the key definitions to this is they facilitate mass personal messages and mass personal interactions. Personal communication has been loosely described as this one-to-many communication. And so if you think about billboards or overpass graffiti or messages on jumbotrons, all of these are examples of mass personal communication. The billboard you see here on the screen, don't read this if you're not Jerry Graff, this is only for him. Sort of one of my more humorous examples of mass personal communication out in the wild. Online, social media really have sort of given us a boost to what mass personal messages can occur. Rather than having to buy a billboard or just graffito and overpass, social media definitionally allow this one-to-many interaction where you can post something on a wall or a timeline and many people can get it. Likewise, someone can reply to you and that's then publicly visible. And so mass personalized are really this, mass personal messages are really these personalized messages sort of intended for one or a small subset of individual receivers, but that are accessible to a much larger audience. And that really is a key denotation of what's a social medium. And we also have this idea of perceived interaction. An important sort of note here is that the interaction has to be perceived. You must believe you can interact with others, even if you can't actually do so. And the reason that we specified the perception of interaction without necessitating interaction is, first of all, think about how many people post messages that don't get replies, comments, likes, etc. That doesn't mean it wasn't posted or wasn't visible. Sometimes we know that people just aren't liking our content. Sometimes we know that the algorithms running these platforms may just not be sort of pushing it up to be seen and be visible to others. And so just because you've posted a message and not gotten that feedback doesn't mean that that's not a possibility. Importantly, the other part of this perceived interaction is especially for organizations, celebrities, sort of the non-interpersonal side of social media. It's the perception that you could interact with someone or something through these channels, whether that's an organization, if you post a message either on an organization's social media page or tag them, at organization here, you have this perception that theoretically they could and should be able to see it. Now, whether or not they respond is up to them. In large part, this is why we see social media really facilitating parasocial relationships. By virtue of, for example, Ryan Reynolds posting on Twitter, I know that he's posting there, or at least his people. You would think that he or his people are reading things. It's not going to guarantee that I can interact with Ryan Reynolds, but the likelihood of Ryan Reynolds at least seeing my content, let alone replying to my content, is exponentially higher on a social medium than it is in person. The likelihood of me walking down the street and bumping into Ryan Reynolds is incredibly low, but the potential to interact with him through social media is much, much higher. Again, he doesn't have to respond, but the fact that I see him and see what he's thinking can facilitate that perception of interaction and often facilitate parasocial relationships. The feeling of closeness and feeling of knowing someone with whom we don't actually have an established relationship or dialogue. And a lot of organizations and celebrities and brands look to social media to use them to facilitate that sense of parasocial relationships. I have a relationship and not a romantic one, not even necessarily a friendly one, but just I'm brand loyal to Starbucks, or I like Ryan Reynolds as a person and feel like I know him, even though he doesn't know that I exist. The last element of social media is definitionally the value of them is derived from user-generated content. And this one's a little bit subjective. I don't think we often go around doing polls of asking media users, well, from what do you derive value? Why do you use this? What do you get the value from? But I think at the very least, heuristically, we can often get a sense of where is the gratification or where is the value of using a page. So for example, if I go to the New York Times, there may be a chat discussion below an article, but the real value of the news article is the news article, the thing that's been generated not by users, but by the organization or the individual. In the same way, if I go to a web page, anything I go to, if I go to whitehouse.gov, that's information generated by the White House, not necessarily by other users. In contrast, social media are places that we go to where there may be information authored by organizations. So if I go to the New York Times page on Instagram, they may share a link to a story. The value is not the story. That's where I'm going to go to the New York Times website to read it. Rather, we get the value from interacting with others. Let's talk about this news story. What does it mean? What are the implications? How does this tie into other things? How is the New York Times reporting this versus other news outlets? That's why we go to that site, is not for the news, but for the interaction with others. That's where the value is generated. By the same token, DeviantArt is a space where artists can go and upload their own artwork. There's lots of places. I could just go on Instagram or Imager and upload my artwork and be done with it. But we actual artists, not me, upload it to DeviantArt to share their work and get comment and get feedback on it. Everything from suggestions, how can I improve brushstrokes or techniques, to what do you think of this? Is this a good framing? Or even how can I buy your work? The value is not the structure that DeviantArt has set up, but rather the value is created by the ability to interact with artists about their work. So why do we make this so abstract? Why do we have this mass personal persistent channel for perceived interactions, yada, yada? Why is this so abstract? Again, one of the challenges with technology is it moves and it evolves quickly. When there's a huge number of potential platforms out there, the reason we want to work abstractly and say this is a social medium, but it should apply to all social media, is when we do research. If we do research on a particular platform, Orkut, 6 Degrees, Vine, Google Plus, how many of these have you ever even heard of? All the ones you see on the screen are now sort of fallen social media platforms. To do a study just on Orkut constrains the findings to Orkut. And as soon as Orkut changes or falls into disuse, is there anything we can learn from the findings? Not really. And so as scholars, we really need to look at the sort of abstract, generalizable component that we're looking at the social media for. What happens when users can interact? What happens when third parties can make claims about a target? We can't do those things in websites. We can do it in social media platforms. Does it matter whether that claim is made in YouTube or in TikTok? If it doesn't, it's a good social media study. If it's something so unique to that one platform, we're not doing a social media study, we're doing a study of TikTok. Now, these are not always invaluable, especially in practice. Practitioners may have much more need for sort of boots on the ground, snapshot, quick, in this moment. How is this particular platform used? But generally, we want to do this abstractly because the things we want to look at and explore and the relationships we're testing and the things we're hypothesizing need to be generalizable across platforms. So the things we learn about today aren't going to be invalid and outdated in 3 or 4 years when you've finished college and you're out doing the next thing. And everything you've learned is no longer relevant because that particular platform has changed or doesn't exist. So working in the abstract in social media is really important because as scholars, we're never going to change as fast as the industries and the platforms themselves do. Having that conceptual understanding allows us to be really flexible. What happens when Twitter tries to change itself to X? I had a study I was trying to do. I was trying to understand the use of blue checks as an authenticating signal for users. Blue checks in Twitter used to be if you were someone of note, sort of social significance, you could go on and say, I'm going to verify this information. You would upload to Twitter a picture of like a driver's license or a passport that would sort of ground truth you are who you are. So if Barack Obama or Oprah Winfrey are going online and claiming this is my Twitter account, you can vet that it's them because Twitter has done their due diligence to ensure that it is in fact you. Once Twitter became X, very quickly that system fell apart and the blue check became a signal that someone had $8 a month to spend. And so the challenge that I had was by working so specifically with Twitter and so specifically this feature, literally overnight, what that feature meant changed. And I wasn't doing good research at that point. So we need to understand conceptually, what are we working with? For example, in this case, external factors that vet someone's offline identity. so that that can be mapped on to the old blue check or verification posts on Reddit and mapped into other domains. So working conceptually really allows us to be flexible with what we know and how we can extend and apply our knowledge. Within social media broadly, there's often two common and sort of very closely aligned types of social media that we often talk about. And the distinction here is the social network site and social networking sites. And a lot of the platforms you think of when you think of social media are probably one or the other of these two sites. Now, there's an important distinction to be made between these. There's a lot of similarities that we have in common, things like having a profile and having a network. Boyd and Ellison have made a really important distinction between these two, which is the types of networks they allow you to reach out to. And Ellison and Boyd's claim is that social network sites are the ones we use to essentially reflect our offline networks as things to keep in touch with people we already know, or maybe not even offline networks, but we know through other online networks. If it's a guild you're a member of, or a gaming group, fantasy football league, even if you don't spend a lot of time physically together, these are people you know. Alternately, they distinguish social networking sites as sites used to expand our networks, places to find new people, meet new groups. This could be something like LinkedIn, where you're looking to expand beyond your known network to potentially find employment opportunities, or it could also be sites like Meetup, where you're looking to find others with shared interests. Again, it seems like a somewhat pedantic difference, but especially when we talk about these and are trying to understand conceptually what's the difference, knowing that nomenclature is really important. So let's talk a little bit about social network sites and the types of ties that individuals can have on them. And I should say here, these also would work for social networking sites, but we've seen much more of this literature about social network sites. Because for a lot of social media, and again, especially for social network sites, we use them to develop and foster and maintain our relational networks. Who do we know? Mark Granovetter years ago set up a tie theory, which said that we have loosely 2 or 3 types of ties and distinguish between strong ties and weak ties. Strong ties are the ties that you have with close friends and family members. These are the people you go to for social support, you know well. They're sort of persistent relationships. We often have very tightly coupled networks. And so, for example, one of your strong ties may be a sibling, but you know your siblings' friends know you and your friends. That sort of dense packed network is really indicative of a strong tie. Social network sites are really great for keeping up with strong ties. If we look at sites ranging from Facebook to Instagram, often a lot of those connections are people that we can lean on for social support, whether it's to learn new things or emotional support, those sorts of things. In contrast, weak ties are looser acquaintances. These may be classmates, friends we've just met, people we were on a sports team with. We know them, we know something about them, but we're not tightly coupled to them. And by this, I mean also, I mean both our network ties. If we actually mapped out who knows who, we only know this person in this one dimension, and they don't know a lot of our network, but also not necessarily people we can rely on for different forms of social support. So that person you're on a pickup basketball league with, if you needed 20 bucks and it would feel awkward to ask to borrow money from them, probably a weak tie. The last type of relational tie is not something defined by network structures or social support, but really is defined by how they fit into your network. And latent ties have been defined as relational ties, either strong or weak, that have functionally gone dormant. And particularly as college scholars, you can think about this, think of like high school friends that you no longer keep in touch with. These are people that for 4 or 12 years you went to school with, you knew deeply, but then you went off to different colleges, or you went into college and they got a job or went into some service, and you kind of lost touch. But we can use social media to keep up with them. One of the ways we can do this is by something known as ambient awareness, by sort of being aware of what people are doing by just passively watching what they're doing on these social media. We can stay current on their events. What are they up to? What are they doing? Who are they dating? Job changes, etc. And the nice thing about this is we can then use that ambient awareness if we need to reactivate the tie, because it allows us to sort of pick up the speed of getting to know someone all over again. So for example, you went away from college, your friend went to a different college, but you've sort of stayed up loosely through Instagram or TikTok, And suddenly you find yourself visiting their town, and you need a place to stay, or maybe information about where to eat food. That ambient awareness allows you to reactivate the latent tie. You drop them a message because that channel still exists. It's a lot easier just to text someone you haven't via Instagram, if you haven't texted them in a while, than it is to suddenly call them or show up at their house. So ambient awareness allows us to maintain that latent tie and then reactivate it. You can drop them a quick message. Hey, I'll be visiting your area soon. Can I crash in your couch, get a restaurant recommendation? What spots should I get a hotel in? Those sorts of things. And possibly even sort of make that conversation easier by, hey, I just saw what you've been doing with your job. Sounds great. I'll be visiting town. Do you want to catch up for coffee? And so we see a lot of ambient awareness being used to maintain ties without taking a lot of effort, and both cognitive and relational effort. So individuals obviously use social media. It's one of our dominant sort of both time sinks and ways we see social media evidenced, but organizations also use social media. And in sort of a no-duh statement, organizations continue to use more of it. This is a slightly outdated chart, but it nicely demonstrates the point that, again, across all social media, organizations aren't trying to be on everything. There's too many. They evolve and emerge and decline too fast to keep track of. But the dominant channels, so this is between 2016 and 2018, LinkedIn, Twitter, Facebook, they try to be on because that's where their audiences are. That's where their receivers are. The other thing is to keep in mind what channels are appropriate for the account to be on. And so again, with so many social media platforms available, it doesn't make sense necessarily for an organization to be on every single platform. And so an organization has to ask itself which one makes sense. Not all organizations should be on every platform. Just because Goldman Sachs Investment Bank exists does not mean it should have an OnlyFans account. But also, what type of content are they producing and what makes it appropriate for their viewers? And so if you have a media industry, whether it's television or radio, having a YouTube account obviously makes a lot of sense. If you're going to be in an investment firm and explaining trends in the market, having a YouTube account makes sense. But that said, if you're working for example, a retirement home, an assisted living home, if that's not where your audience is, if retirees or those looking for convalescent care aren't on Instagram, there's probably not a reason to be on Instagram. And so I bring up this chart mostly to talk about, yes, organizations are on social media, but they're not necessarily on everything. These numbers have since increased, but not universally. It's not to say every organization is on every platform these days. And indeed, in looking at marketing mix and media mix, a lot of organizations are joining and leaving different social media platforms as the platforms change and their audiences change. One of the biggest factors in deciding which platforms to be on and which not to be on is this idea of engagement. Organizations are often seeking engagement. Now, one of the challenges is that engagement is a nebulous term. What it means to you may not be what it means to your neighbor, and certainly likely not what it means to a particular employer. There's lots of forms to engage on social media. We can like things, we can comment on things, we can click through things, we can follow links, we can talk with others about it. All of these are different metrics and forms of engagement. And so if you're working for an organization, working with an organization, and they say their goal on social media is engagement, the first question to ask is, what do you mean by that? Because if the organization just wants a lot of likes, that's going to lead to different content and different types of sort of prompting in the content than looking for interactions. We want people to comment on this or talk about it, and it's going to be different than the click-through frequency. How often are people looking at a social media post and following a link through to other content? One of the biggest manifestations we get for organizational social media is it allows us a lot to interact with stakeholders. So again, what does engagement mean? Sometimes it's the interaction, them talking to us and us as the organization talking back. And so we see sites like Yelp, which again, mass personal. The content is primarily derived from other users. We go to Yelp not for professional reviews, but reviews of restaurants and other facilities from users just like us, and the perception of interactivity. You can go on and post a Yelp review for an organization, and the organization can reply. They need not. They probably always shouldn't and can't reply to everything, but it does allow you to act with them, to interact with them. So if you go into a restaurant, you post on Yelp, this wasn't really great. The food wasn't spectacular. The organization can come back and go, oh man, hey, thanks for the feedback, and come back and try us again, or here are the things we fixed, or just say, hey, that's not helpful feedback. Forget you. Go kick rocks. One of the big benefits for both organizations and individuals is social media are fantastic at allowing lightweight interactions. When we talk about what does interaction mean, it doesn't mean stopping someone on the quad and having a 15-minute dialogue with them or taking a lot of cognitive or communicative resources to engage. Instead, most social media platforms allow really quick and simple interactions. One of the most common of these is paralinguistic digital affordances. This has been abbreviated PDA. These are the one-click cues that we can send. Everything from likes and favorites, upvotes in some channels, plus ones, whatever your platform is calling it. And PDAs are really diverse, even though they may have a specific meaning. So I'm going to stick with like here, thumbs up. They're very subjective in how we both send them and interpret them. And importantly, senders and receivers can interpret them differently. And so if an organization posts, hey, we're having a sale on Wednesday, and they receive a like to that, what does that like mean? It may mean someone literally likes that sale and the announcement of it. Great. It may mean people are just bookmarking it. I like things often to be able to come back and find that quickly by looking through my likes. It may be sort of ironic of, well, things are on sale every day, so okay, and sort of a tongue-in-cheek PDA. But at the end of the day, these take very little time. We can go through as users and like things or upvote things or downvote things very quickly. And it provides a very quick yet sort of psychologically meaningful way of interacting with organizations or others. So by now we've gotten through a lot of the components of social media, but this isn't the time to stop thinking about it. There's a lot of things further to consider. So again, go back and what's the difference between a social network site and a social networking site? But beyond just the definitional difference, why does it matter? How does it change the nature of your use of the site, the types of people you interact with or expect to interact with, or which ones you join or not? Think about how your use of social media platforms differ for the types of ties that you interact with. How is your use of Instagram, TikTok, Imgur, Reddit? How does that differ for close friends versus more distal acquaintance relationships? Lastly, how are social media enabling new ways to interact? And this might not just be relative to the ways we can interact offline. Offline, I've always been able to give a thumbs up. It's a little different online now. It's awkward if you're talking with someone just to give a thumbs up and walk away. But even more so, how are they changing the way we've interacted relative to earlier social media channels? And if you can remember back to prior channels, early days of Facebook or Orkut or Club Penguin, or maybe even things like MySpace that still exists but may not be used as heavily. How do we use social media now differently? As these things change, and they always will, the ways we use them and understand and create meaning and communicate through them will as well. So with that, scholars, we have gotten social. Thank you for sticking with me. I appreciate it, and we'll see you next time.